Final chapter about optimal climate policy is about the relative importance of the three ethical parameters and about how to choose their values. Climate change is a long-term problem, it's an uncertain problem, it's a global problem, and therefore if you do not care about the distant future, remote probabilities of faraway lands, you do not care about climate change. But how important are these three concerns relative to one another? I'm going to start talking about the discount rate. I'm going to ignore equity and I'm going to ignore uncertainty for the moment. And I'm going to show this graph, four versions of this graph. So let's look a little bit closer and see what is going on here. On the vertical axis, we have the social cost of carbon, the intensity of climate policy, the tax that we would want to impose on greenhouse gas emissions. And on the horizontal axis, we have the curvature of the utility function. I call that here the rate of risk aversion. And then we have three alternative pure rates of time preference, 1%, 2%, and 3%. The first thing that you notice is that the green curve lies above the blue curve, lies above the brown curve. That is, the lower the social cost of carbon, the lower the pure rate of time preference, the more we care about the future, the greater the social cost of carbon. That is what you see here. That is what you see here. Now, if you look this way, what you see is that the more curved the utility function becomes, the lower the social cost of carbon. And this follows from the Ramsey rule. The Ramsey rule says that the money discount rate R is the pure rate of time preference rho plus the curvature of the utility function eta times the gross rate of consumption G. That means that for given rho and for given G, that the greater eta, that is we move to the right in this graph, the harder we discount the future. Essentially, the greater eta, the more emphasis we place on our current poor self relative to our richer future self. This is without concerns for equity, without concerns for uncertainty. So let's now introduce equity. And I showed previously that if you apply equity weights, you put more emphasis on the plight of the poor, and therefore the social cost of carbon goes up. And that is what we see if we compare this graph relative to this graph. The effect of the pure rate of time preference is still the same. The green curve lies above the blue curve, lies above the brown curve. But if we focus on a risk aversion of 1, actually an equity aversion now, then you see that the distance to zero here is larger than the distance to zero here. These two graphs are drawn on the same scale. So equity weights raise the social cost of carbon. And actually you see something else happening. The green curve here disappears to zero. Here it doesn't. It actually starts going up again. The relationship between the curvature of the utility function and the social cost of carbon is ambiguous. In some parts of the parameter space it goes down as the rate of risk aversion increases, and in other parts the social cost of carbon goes up. And essentially the rate of risk aversion plays two roles. It governs the trade-offs between your current poor self and future rich versions of yourself, but it also governs the trade-off between poor people and rich people. And what you see here, if the utility function is sufficiently curved, then the latter dominates the former. That is, trade-offs between rich and poor people start to dominate trade-offs between current selves, current poor selves, and future rich selves. So that explains why the curve is going up. We just put more and more emphasis on what is going on in poor countries. Now there's something else going on with the blue curve and the brown curve. They become negative. It's a social benefit of carbon. We want to subsidize greenhouse gas emissions rather than tax them. Now, how can this be? Well, we are in a part of the parameter space where we discount the future pretty hard, right? The rate of risk aversion, the eta in the Ramsey rule is pretty high, and our pure rate of time preference is pretty high, and we put a lot of emphasis on the poor. And then we find that we want to subsidize CO2 emissions. The reason for this is we're only focusing on the short run, right? Because we discount the future hard. So we focus on the short run and we focus what is going on in poor countries. Is there a benefit of climate change that primarily falls in poor countries? Yes, there is. It's called CO2 fertilization. There's more CO2 in the atmosphere, then plants grow faster and they become more drought resistant. And this is of a particularly large benefit for poor people who spend a much greater share of their income on food and are much more likely to work in agriculture than richer people. And furthermore, the fertilization effect of carbon dioxide is immediate. It's in the next growing season, whereas the temperature effects, the climate changing effects of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere come with a delay because of the heat capacity of the ocean. So this is an effect that occurs immediately and in the short run, and it dominates the negative impacts of climate change that come later and are discounted hard with these parameters. So let's now ignore equity and look at uncertainty. What is the effect? Well, same graph again, but different different parameterization. The green curve lies above the blue curve, lies above the brown curve, right? The effect of the pure rate of time preference is still the same. The impact of the curvature of the utility function is again ambiguous. So if we start at this point, if we increase the rate of risk aversion, we discount the future harder, and therefore the social cost of carbon falls. But then what happens here is that we put more and more emphasis on the risks, because that is what a high rate of risk aversion means. And that starts to dominate the discounting effect, and actually you see that the green curve here skyrockets, and that is because we actually start to put a lot of emphasis on those small probabilities that things will go dramatically wrong that we talked about before. And you see that the effect of risk is actually quite strong, also quite strong relative to the pure rate of time preference. Now, let's do everything together. We reintroduce equity into the analysis. We still have an ambiguous relationship between the curvature of the utility function and the social cost of carbon. That hasn't disappeared. What you actually see is that the equity weights considerably raise the social cost of carbon. Actually, the difference between this graph and this graph is smaller than the difference between this graph and this graph. So equity weights and uncertainty actually reinforce one another, have a synergistic effect. So that is one thing you see. The other thing that you see is that these carbon subsidies that I was talking about earlier disappear. The CO2 fertilization effect has not disappeared, but we actually care more about the risks we pose on poorer countries later than we care about the benefits that we impose on them in the shorter run. Final thing that I want to say, if we compare this graph with this graph, we actually see that uncertainty is a bigger concern than equity, at least according to this model, at least according to this particular parameterization. Now, if we focus on the bottom right graph, then essentially what we see is that we can get basically any answer that we want for the social cost of carbon. We can argue that the social cost of carbon should be 1,000, and we can argue that it should be close to 0. Just depends on what parameters we pick, what ethical parameters we pick. And this is all for the same climate scenarios and for the same climate model and for the same impact assumptions about the impacts of climate change. Everything else is the same. The only thing that differs here is what is the pure rate of time preference, what is the rate of risk aversion, what is the curvature of the utility function. And depending on these parameters, we can talk the social cost of carbon up or down. So the question then becomes, what should these values be? Rates of pure time preference, the rate of inequity aversion, the rate of risk aversion describe how much we care about the future, and how much we care about others, how much we care about uncertainties. And depending on the number that we pick, we get very different recommendations for climate policy. Now, there's two approaches to set these parameters. And one approach is to say, well, this is complicated. This is beyond me. These are very difficult questions. How much should I care about others? How much should I care about risk? How much should I care about the future? These are very difficult questions. So I can consult people who are smarter than me. And throughout history, philosophers and religious people have said things about these that could help you guide in those parameters. And Aristotle, for instance, has argued very strongly against discounting, against usury, as it was known, and said that, well, really it is unethical to discount the future just because it is the future. You can take that as guidance. You could, of course, also argue, well, who is Aristotle and why would I take the opinion of an old geezer who has been dead for 2,500 years? You could argue, well, Aristotle had pretty repugnant ideas about slavery and about women, so why should I believe him? But you can pick other people who argue very similarly, Mohammed being one, Lord Stern being another. So if you want to follow their opinion, then it's fine. You could, of course, also consult Jesus or the Bible about this, but then you would find actually that there's very little that the Bible has to say about time preference. But the Bible, of course, has very strong things to say about how we treat others. And the same is true for the Quran. And if you follow their guidance, then yeah, you would have a strong aversion against inequity. The Quran also forbids gambling, so you would also have a strong aversion against risk-taking. And you can take their advice. You can also look at contemporary people like Lady Gaga. You've seen here taking her the appropriate place in history. And she doesn't have a lot to say about risk and doesn't have a lot to say about time, but she does have a lot to say about how we treat and how we should treat others. So that is one way of doing this. But the problem here is that if this is done by a government that is supposedly serving the people, essentially this is the government imposing the will of essentially a random person. This is paternalism. So perhaps this is not a good idea if you believe in democracy. So the alternative approach that you could take is to look at reveal preferences, to estimate what is the time preference of the average voter or the median voter, and what is the risk preference of the median voter. Now, that sounds fine in principle. The problem is that it's twofold. One is that these parameters are actually very difficult to estimate, and there's lots and lots and lots of estimates out there in the literature, and they don't agree with each other at all. So that is one problem. You could say, well, this is what I want to do, but doing it is actually a bit harder. And the second is that the way people express these values, and they do so all the time, even though it's hard to measure, sorry, the way people, the values that people express are not necessarily the values that people should express. So if you take the decision to study, essentially what you do is you decide to go to college, and that means that you will enter the labor market later, but hopefully get a better salary. Now, you can see this as an investment in the future and can measure the sort of cost, the foregone salaries in these years that you are at university, and you can trade them off against the higher income that you would have after you graduate. And you would say, well, this is my the measure of my time preference. But of course, that is not entirely true, because this is actually a risky investment. You don't know what job you're going to get after you graduate. So it's not a measure of time preference, it's a measure of time and equity, time and uncertainty wrapped together. And there's, of course, also, typically there are subsidies for you going to college. So it is not a private preference, but it's a mix of private and social preferences that come in there, because your decision is essentially also guided by how much subsidy do I get in terms of subsidized loans and income support and so on and so forth while you're studying. And then there is, of course, the issue, well, the fact that you as an individual are willing to make the bet that you're going to earn a higher income when you graduate. You are prepared to make that bet, but does that mean that you think that society should be making those same bets? No, that doesn't follow, because society as a whole is much more diversified than you are, so it faces a different risk than you would. And similarly, the fact that you are prepared to discount your future hard, does that mean that you also think that the government should discount the future as hard as you do in your private life? No, there's a difference between preferences for yourself and preferences for society. And that all makes that going down the route of revealed preferences is difficult. Difficult as well, both in trying to measure these things and then trying to interpret what they actually mean. Final thing I want to say in here, that whatever approach you take, I think you should be consistent. I think that as a matter of principle, people should at least try to be consistent with themselves. But in a democracy, consistency is particularly important, because one important aspect of democracy is that a government can explain itself. And explaining yourself means that if you do something in one situation and something completely different in a different situation, then you cannot explain yourself. You are being inconsistent. So if in your trade policy or in your immigration policy you show a strong disregard for the people of Africa, then it is very peculiar if in your climate policy all of a sudden you show a great concern for the people of Africa. And if you're in Europe at the moment, then we're slowly filling up the Mediterranean Sea with bodies of dead Africans who are trying to cross into Europe. It suggests that our immigration policy actually almost tries to kill as many Africans as possible. That seems to be our revealed preference. But then if you look at the climate policies that Europe proposes, then all of a sudden is a great concern for the plight of the same people, essentially those same Africans. And that is inconsistent. I think that the implication is that we should reform our immigration policy, but if you like our immigration policy as it is, then perhaps you should shout not so loud about climate policy.